What's up guys, Shawnthebro here, and in today's episode of the Fighting Game tutorial series, we're going to be going over improving our main menu, because I want to do a lot more with it, and this was one of the first widgets that we actually had worked on. So even though we improved it as we went, it is lacking in a few areas, and we can improve it with a few short things I'm going to show you today. So one thing is mouse control. Technically, we do have the ability to click on a button and go into it. So if I click on story, we do go into it. However, you'll notice that the hover button is broken. So if we try and hover over these buttons, we just get this white square, which looks terrible. It doesn't look like how it should. For the story button, I've already set it up to work with the hover, and that looks much nicer. I've also done this for the online, which is good because not only can we hover, but we can press and you can see the selected and hovered. So you see the little effect that happens when we click on it. Now this button isn't set up to work off of mouse input yet, but that's another thing we'll cover. So mouse inputs in the main menu are really important for users that do want to use the mouse, and if you want to support it, then I recommend doing so, because having more ways to communicate with the game is pretty much always better. Additionally, I would like to clean up the back end to make it so much easier to control and add new features for. Now, before we get started, if you want to get caught up in the series, I'll link you to the entire playlist of the Fighting Game tutorial series right here. You can see how we've done everything from our menus to our combat to our hitboxes and a lot more. Now, if you don't care about that and you only care about the main menu, I will link you to the previous episode where we initially set up a lot of the behavior for the pop-outs, like the online submenus right here. With all of that out of the way, we can go ahead and get started on the episode. There is a lot to do today, but most of it's very quick, so this shouldn't be too bad of an episode. First thing we want to do is go into the main menu screen widget. Inside here is our actual main menu, and so this is what we have for our main menu designer view. And we have all of our buttons and everything on this widget here. Now, one thing that I think we should do is go into each of the buttons, go to the appearance style section, and fill out the hovered and pressed sections here. Hovered is literally hovering the mouse over top of it, like when we were doing this with the story or the join button. Pressed is when we actually click on it. So I would recommend that you go to all your buttons and go to your hovered section, use your hovered image. So I have button P1 hover variation 1, default image size, tint, draw as are all fine. You could change this to draw as image if you want. The margin is also up to you. You can change this to whatever value you want. So you could set it to 0. Doesn't really matter for my images specifically, but it very well could for your images. And the pressed as well. So I have a button P1 selected and hovered, which is basically the pressed. Here's my image size, draw as a box, margin, put it to 0 just because I don't need it. You could go through and do this for all your buttons, and really it's not a bad idea, but we actually don't have to. We can make it more automatic than that. We can basically automate this process. We can let all the buttons clear to these values. So let's go into the graph and let's take a look at our event graph. Not any of the functions, just the event graph to start. I had set up these clear selection events, which basically just take in a specific button and set the style of it. And specifically for these clear selections, we were setting the style back to the default behavior when they weren't hovered, so the gray button. That was the whole point of these events. This is still important. However, this, having one event for each button, is an outdated method. And you'll notice if you watch this series, a lot of the other widgets I have don't have anything like this. They have one event called clear selection that takes in a button to clear and then sets the style. Now we set this up for the online buttons in the main menu, but we should really utilize this for all of our buttons on the main menu. And additionally, we can go one step further. So you'll see here in clear selection that I am setting the button style of the button to clear. And we were passing in our button variation 1, our box, our sizes, all that good stuff. However, the hovered behavior, style hovered, and the pressed behavior, style pressed, were never touched. So hovered and pressed would never work. They'd be reset as soon as clear selection was called. Instead, we can use clear selection and set up all of this behavior. So, quick refresher here. This is a button to clear. This is a button object reference. We can drag off of it and call set style. In this case, I'm using this one, but either of them will work. And then I was splitting the struct pin for the style, and then I was splitting the struct pin for style normal, and that's as far as I got in the series. To add to today's episode, we can split the style hovered struct pin and the style pressed struct pin. And that's how you get what you see here. So I know it's a really big node, but this is one possibility. For me personally, it doesn't bother me, especially if we're only going to be using it in this one event and clearing out all these other events that we had. And so now what you want to do is make sure your style normal is covered, your hovered is covered, and your pressed is covered. The main things you want to change are the hovered image and the pressed image. And then for your draw as, again, I was using box before. It looked slightly different than image on my widget, and I prefer the look of it, but that really is just a preference thing. And the rest you can pretty much leave alone unless you want to modify it further. And you'll see I even did it in the Clear Selection 1 event here. This is for my story button. This is why when I go into the menu, I can hover over the story button, but I can't hover over things like versus online practice because I only set it up for the story button. Now the online mode buttons work because I have set them up using the clear selection event. So they work by default once I've set this event up. One thing we should do is get rid of all these clear selection events that we have for each individual button and just leave the global clear selection event now. To do this, let's go into the function clear past selections. Now inside of this function, what we were doing was determining if the submenu for the online game modes was open or not. If it was, we were going down the true path, and if it wasn't, we were going down the false path. In here, what we were doing was just checking the current P1 selection and then calling the proper clear selections. This did work, and it was really fun when we had like 2 or 3 options on the main menu, but throughout the series, we have grown a lot, and it is becoming ridiculous to continuously use this. So what we did for the online submenu was pretty good. We did check the selection, and then we called clear selection, passing in the button to clear. That was a little bit better, but we can improve on this a lot still. Consider it this way. If we pass in a button reference and say this is the button that we want to use, that we want to clear or we want to set as the hovered button, then we won't have to look at each individual index and reset specific buttons. We could actually just compare and see if the button we're looking at is the button that the player is currently on, in which case we can make it a blue button and make all other buttons gray, right? Because that's what happens when we're in the game. The button that the player is selecting is the blue button. The other ones are all gray. So all this ugly logic could be solved if we passed in a button, or if we knew the index of the button that we were currently on and what widget that actually tied to. So in this case, what we can do is add all of our buttons in the same order that they are on the design view here. So story, arcade, versus online, practice, profile, settings, store, credits, quit. The submenus can be left alone for now. We are going to update them, but we'll do that after the initial pass here. So story, arcade, versus. Let's start getting these ready in the right order. Story, arcade, versus. So I have these 3 buttons. Then we have online, practice, profile. So online, practice, profile, settings, store, credits, quit. Settings, store, credits, and quit. Those are all of the main buttons on our main menu. And so this is really important because we can actually make an array out of all these buttons. And we can do so by typing make array and adding pins for each index that we have. We want to add them in the same order to make our lives as easy as possible. It's definitely possible to do this without having them in the same order as they are on the design view. but no reason to make our lives more complicated when we don't need to. There we go. So we can make an array of all of our buttons. Now, an array has each one of these buttons stored at this index that it shows here. Now, if we were to compare the current P1 selection with the index from the array, we would know if it is the button that the player is currently selecting. So if I am to drag off the array and type get a copy, and I can pass confirm P1 selection into this. Actually, I want current P1 selection. Confirmed is the one that we chose, that we actually clicked into, but the current P1 selection is which one we're currently selecting. So current P1 selection, get from this array. If we were to get the value at this index within this array, say current P1 selection was index 1, we would know that would be tied to the arcade mode button. So the arcade mode button should display as blue. All the other buttons will display as gray. So let's go ahead and do this now. Let's add a for loop for each loop, because we want to loop through all of them, and really we want to check if the element at this index is equal to the current array element. We can do this by checking equal equal and putting an equal object, or you could actually just check against the array index. Either way will work. Then we can drag this into a branch. Now, if this is true, that the array element we are looping through is equal to the array element at this index, for example, again, the arcade mode button, if that's the loop iteration that we're on, and that's the array element, we know the arcade mode button is the one that should be blue. So we want to set its style to the blue color. Otherwise, we'll want to set it to the gray color. And I think before we even do this, this is easier. If we just do array index equal equal integer current P1 selection. They both work the same, and you can use either, but I think this is even easier to understand. Instead of comparing array elements, we're literally just checking to see if the array index that we're on is the same as the current P1 selection. If it is, we'll make it the blue button. If it's not, we'll make it the gray button. And it's literally that simple. So at this point, what I would do is remove everything that we have in the true section for clear path selections. We don't need any of this anymore. You can keep it if you want for reference or whatever the case may be, but I am going to get rid of it. And instead I'm going to put this behavior here. So, might be a little bit ugly, but something like that should do the trick. Actually, it looks pretty good. So we have our array here. Putting it into a for each loop, we're checking to see if the array index is equal to the current P1 selection. If it is, remember, we want to set the style to the blue button. If it's not, we want to set it to the gray button. This is clear path selection, so what we have right now is the clear selection function. For button to clear, we want to pass in the array element of the for each loop. So you can clean this up however you see fit. Something like that should do the trick. Now, this looks pretty good, and honestly, this should work for all of our buttons now. So if I go to hover over any of them, they all show up as blue. And that looks wonderful. I'm very happy with that. This means that the press will also work for them, and you can see that it does. I haven't set up the press events for these with the mouse, so I can't actually go into a lot of them, but you can see that the press event and the hover events are working. And of course, the keyboard and gamepad navigation will also work the same way. Nothing will be ruined because of this method. We're just adding more ways to be able to navigate the menu and give control to the player. We do have to fill out the true of this branch, but that kind of requires us to go into move selection border, or at least move some things from move selection border. So let's hold off on that for a second. Now, we could actually clean up the online submenu stuff as well. Let's get rid of all of this. And now we want to do the same thing as we did above, but using a new array. So we need our host and join buttons. It's true that you don't necessarily need to do this for two elements. But if you want to expand upon it, doing it this way will make it quite easy. So we have 2 elements, make array, and we'll put it somewhere here. It should be good. We'll drag off of a for each loop. Something like that. Then we want to drag off the array index and check if it's equal integer. And we're going to check if it's equal to current P1 selection. Then add a branch. And if it's false, we want to call clear selection. And we want to use array element here as the button to clear. Now, you could clean this up even more since these are the same basic sets of logic here. You could use a select or something to determine your path, but this is already improved significantly. So now when we play the game, I should be able to go to online and both of these should work. Join works and host works. Now, you'll notice if you're already hovering over an option with the keyboard or your gamepad, and then you try and hover over it with the mouse, it will still turn white. We're going to go fix that, and that is going to be for our true condition here. Let's go to move selection border like I mentioned earlier. This one is the same case where it's got a lot of repeating logic that could easily be cleaned up. And we are more than advanced enough now to know how to do that. And so that's exactly what we're going to do. Now what we were doing was taking the selection that we were moving to, grabbing the proper index and the switch statement, and then setting the style for the story mode button. It's really not an issue, but to be honest, there's no reason for us to do almost any of this. Sure, it was working, but now our clear path selection can handle all of it. We can literally disconnect the true and the false of this branch, which means we can really disconnect this branch altogether. So none of this logic will fire, and we'll go ahead and only have this behavior in move selection border that is actually firing right now. Now let's go back to clear path selections, and let's take a look at what our true branch should say. Now the true is going to do the opposite of clear selection. So let's go back to the event graph, and clear selection is resetting the style of the button to be button var1. Button var1 is button variation 1, and it just is the standard gray button. However, if this branch returns true in clear path selections, we want to display the blue button. That's what I kept saying. And so we need to have a set style where it's not using button variation 1, but instead btn hover variation 1. And so what I would do is actually just make another event here, and we'll call it something like set selection, and we'll call that function instead. You can get rid of clear selection 1 through 10 or as many as you had. We don't need them anymore. We only need the default one. So I've cleaned up the main menu significantly by doing this. So this is clear selection. We can quite literally copy this, paste it, and change the custom event name. Let's rename it to set selection. Now we want to change the style normal image to be the hover variation, btnp1 hover variation 1. If I go back into clear path selections, I can change this to set selection. And we want to pass in the array element still. So it's still going to be the button in here. And now you'll notice if I come in here, nothing happens, and this is because the move selection border is no longer calling clear path selections. It was in each one of these paths, which is incredibly disgusting. We can clean this up by simply adding clear path selections right here. So move selection border now has these nodes right here, but also we're calling clear path selections as soon as we go into it after we play the sound effect. Now we can play the game again. You'll see that the color works, and if I am to hover over the button, while I have control of it with the mouse, it doesn't break. It doesn't go to that ugly white box. Now the online mode buttons are not going to work right now either, but we can fix that. We can go into ClearPath selections and we can call set selection. And just like that, our online mode buttons will work. There you go. So we cleaned that up a lot, and I'm really happy with that. There's one more thing we can do now. So if we go back to move selection border, we can get rid of all this behavior. Every single thing in here after this branch, or really up to this branch, gone. We can get rid of it. So move selection border just looks like that now. And this leaves a few things that we can do from here as well. So first of all, move selection border is basically just used to determine if we should play a sound effect and then call the ClearPath selections, which actually determines the appearance of each of the buttons. Doesn't really seem that we need a function to do that, in my opinion, and the selection parameter is no longer being used. So move selection border could remove the selection parameter if we want. And now it will look like this, which is even cleaner. When we remove that variable, we're going to get errors where we were calling move selection border. So let's go into the standard move selection function. In here, we're calling move selection and we're passing in current P1 selection. At this point, we really don't need to be doing that anymore, so we can refresh both of these move selection border nodes. And that will clean this area up. But at this point, do we really need to be calling a move selection border function? It's not moving the selection of the border anymore. I personally would say no. I think what we should do is this. Move everything from ClearPath selections into move selection border. Instead of calling this function here, just let this function, move selection border, be what was this function, ClearPath selections. And to do that, we can copy everything from ClearPath selections, paste it into move selection border. Alright, then we can remove the call to ClearPath selections since we don't need that anymore. And we can actually delete ClearPath selections. So now we have event graph, move selection, and move selection border. Now we still want to link it up the right way, so make sure we don't mess this up. So there we go. Move selection border now looks like this. It has the branch for the play sound effects. It goes to a custom play sound 2D. Then we have the behavior that we set up earlier in this episode. So now this is significantly cleaner, and I like it a lot. However, at this point, I don't really want to call it move selection border anymore. In my honest opinion, that's not what it's doing at this point. At this point, it is just going to be determine button styles. Now, when you rename the function here, it is going to rename it in the function calls. It's going to rename it in the function itself. And so there won't be any issues, but I'm going to call it that. That way I know what's going on. And you'll see everywhere it is used has been changed. And there we go, guys. Our main menu screen is so much cleaner in such a short amount of time. So now adding new buttons to it is very, very simple. And we have full mouse support for hovering and pressing. So anyway, guys, I hope you enjoyed this episode, and if you did, please subscribe. It does more for myself and the channel than anything else you can do, and I just really appreciate it. I want to give a huge shout out to my YouTube membership, Patreon, and Discord supporters. Thank you guys so much. You guys are awesome, and you keep this series alive, so I am incredibly grateful. If you want to join, you can check out the Patreon benefits right here in the top right corner. If you had any issues with this tutorial or any of my tutorials, feel free to join the Discord community. There's a link in the description, and then it's completely free. So thank you so much for watching. I'm Shawnthebro, and I'll see you in the next one. Goodbye, guys.